The Galactic Council's emergency session had been called for the third time this cycle, and Ambassador Krelthax could feel his 6 hearts beating in an increasingly erratic pattern. The holographic displays around the circular chamber showed star maps with red zones spreading like some kind of cosmic disease. Each red marker represented another world that had gone silent after the arrival of what the intelligence reports called the Shade. "Honored delegates," began Supreme Counselor Vexenari, her crystalline voice echoing through the chamber's translation matrix. "We have lost contact with 17 more systems in the past rotation. The pattern remains consistent. No distress signals, no evacuation attempts, no survivors." The assembled representatives from across the galaxy shifted uncomfortably in their species-specific seating arrangements. The Altarians' feathers rustled with anxiety, while the silicon-based quartzlings emitted low harmonic frequencies that translated as deep concern. Even the normally stoic mechanicals seemed to vibrate with barely contained worry. Krelthax raised one of his forearms, the gesture activating his speaking privilege. "Supreme Counselor, surely our combined fleets can handle this threat. The Galactic Defense Force has never failed to protect our worlds." A bitter laugh echoed from the Voidnari delegation, their ambassador's shadowy form rippling with dark amusement. "You haven't been paying attention, Krelthax. 3 of our most advanced battle groups encountered this Shade, near the Epsilon sector. We found their ships 3 days later floating dead in space. No weapons fire, no hull breaches, no signs of struggle. The crews were simply gone." The chamber fell into an uncomfortable silence. The Voidnari were known throughout the galaxy as master assassins and shadow warriors. If they were concerned about a single entity, the situation was far worse than anyone had imagined. "What exactly are we dealing with?" asked the Terran delegate. A species so new to the galactic community that many still questioned their inclusion in the council. The human woman, Ambassador Sarah Chen, had been quiet throughout most of the session, but her question carried a weight that made several delegates turn their attention toward her. Supreme Counselor Vexenari activated the central holographic display, showing grainy sensor footage from one of the few automated surveillance drones that had survived an encounter with their mysterious enemy. The image was distorted and filled with static, but the shape that moved through it was unmistakably humanoid, though wrong in ways that made the organic delegate's skin crawl. "We call it the Shade," Vexenari explained, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "It appears to be a single entity, though our xenobiologists cannot determine its exact species of origin. What we do know is that it possesses capabilities that defy our understanding of physics, biology, and warfare." The image on the display shifted, showing security footage from a research station. The timestamp indicated the recording was only 6 days old. The station appeared normal at first, with scientists and staff going about their daily routines. Then the lights began to flicker and shadows seemed to move independently of their sources. "It doesn't use weapons in any conventional sense," continued the Supreme Counselor. "Instead, it seems to manipulate fear itself, turning the victims' own minds against them. Entire populations have been found in a state that our medical experts can only describe as psychological dissolution. They remain physically unharmed but completely unresponsive, as if their consciousness has simply departed." Ambassador Chen leaned forward in her seat, her dark eyes studying the footage with an intensity that made several nearby delegates unconsciously shift away from her. Humans, while physically unremarkable compared to many galactic species, had an unsettling quality that made others nervous. Perhaps it was their binocular predator eyes or the way they seemed to analyze everything as a potential threat. "Has anyone actually survived a direct encounter with this entity?" Chen asked. "One," replied the Voidnari ambassador, his form becoming even more indistinct as he spoke. "A deep space trader named Zixalth. He was found drifting in an escape pod near the Kethvar system, catatonic but alive. When our mind healers finally managed to establish communication with him, he could only repeat 3 words: 'Death walks freely.'" The chamber erupted in nervous chatter as delegates began speaking among themselves in their various languages. The translation matrix struggled to keep up with the overlapping conversations, creating a cacophony of electronic voices that only added to the growing sense of panic. Ambassador Chen remained silent, her gaze fixed on the holographic display where the security footage continued to loop. In the recording, the Shade moved through the research station like smoke given form, and wherever it passed, the staff simply stopped moving, their eyes becoming vacant and lifeless. "What was the research station studying?" she asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the noise and bringing an immediate hush to the chamber. Supreme Counselor Vexnari consulted her datapad before responding. It was a xenoarchaeological facility, investigating pre-spaceflight ruins on Kethvar Prime. They had recently discovered what appeared to be some kind of ancient hibernation chamber, though they never determined what species had built it. Chen nodded slowly, and something in her expression made Krelthax's skin crawl. There was a calculating look in the human's eyes, the same expression he had seen on apex predators just before they struck. "I'd like to request access to all available data on this entity," Chen said, her tone remaining perfectly diplomatic despite the boldness of her request. "The Terran Federation may be new to the galactic community, but we have some experience dealing with unusual threats." The Voidnari ambassador's form rippled with what might have been amusement. "With respect, Ambassador Chen, your species has barely developed faster than light travel. What could humans possibly offer against a threat that has defeated our most advanced civilizations?" Chen's smile was small and cold, and for just a moment the temperature in the chamber seemed to drop several degrees. "We're from what you call a death world, Ambassador. We didn't develop space travel because we ran out of things to fight on our own planet. We developed it because we were looking for new challenges." The silence that followed her words was deafening. Every delegate in the chamber was suddenly reminded of the classification reports they had received when humanity first applied for council membership. Terra, the human homeworld, was listed as a Class 12 death world, a planet so hostile to life that most species couldn't survive there without extensive technological support. "Very well," said Supreme Counselor Vexnari after a long pause. "You will have access to our files, Ambassador Chen, though I fear even your species' legendary tenacity may not be enough to face what we're dealing with." Chen stood from her seat, and despite being one of the smallest beings in the chamber, her presence seemed to fill the entire space. "We'll see about that." The data archive aboard the human vessel Persistence hummed with activity as Ambassador Chen and her small team of specialists pored over the intelligence files the Galactic Council had provided. The ship itself was unremarkable by galactic standards, built with the functional aesthetic that humans seem to prefer over the elegant curves and artistic flourishes favored by other species. Dr. James Reeves, the team's xenopsychologist, looked up from his workstation with bloodshot eyes. He had been analyzing the psychological profiles of the Shade's victims for the past 18 hours without a break, sustained only by coffee and what he called stubborn human stupidity. "Sarah, you need to see this," he said, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "I've been comparing the brain scans from the survivors, and there's a pattern that doesn't make sense." Chen moved to his station, her own fatigue hidden behind the disciplined facade she maintained as humanity's representative to the galaxy. The holographic display showed a series of brain scans from different species, each one marked with areas of unusual neural activity. "Look at the hippocampus regions," Reeves continued, highlighting specific areas on each scan. "In every case, the fear centers of the brain show massive overactivity, but not in the way you'd expect from a normal terror response. It's like the victims experienced every nightmare they'd ever had all at once, and their minds simply couldn't process it." "What about the human survivors?" Chen asked, though she already suspected what the answer would be. "That's just it," Reeves said, his expression troubled. "There haven't been any human encounters with this thing. Every affected system had populations that evacuated their human personnel before the Shade arrived. It's like they knew something was coming." Chen frowned and moved to the communications console. "Computer, show me the evacuation records for the affected systems. Cross-reference with human personnel assignments." The ship's AI, speaking in the calm, gender-neutral voice that humanity had standardized for their systems, responded immediately. Evacuation orders were issued by local human military advisors in each system approximately 72 hours before the Shade's arrival. Stated reason: unspecified security concerns. "Interesting," Chen murmured. "Get me a connection to Admiral Morrison on Earth. Priority Alpha clearance." The main view screen flickered to life, showing the weathered face of Admiral Thomas Morrison, the head of Terran military intelligence. His gray hair was disheveled, and the timestamp on the transmission indicated it was the middle of the night in his time zone. "Ambassador," he said without preamble. I was wondering when you'd call. You're asking about the evacuations, aren't you? You knew about the shade before it started attacking, Chen stated rather than asked. How? Morrison's expression grew grim. Because it's not the first time we've encountered something like this. Dr. Reeves, you're on this channel too, right? You might want to sit down for this. Reeves pulled up a chair and Chen could see her team gathering around the console. Whatever Morrison was about to tell them, it was clearly classified at the highest levels. In 2157, during the early colonial expansion, we encountered something similar on Kepler 42b. Morrison began. The colonists started reporting nightmares, then waking hallucinations, then complete psychological breakdown. We sent in a research team, and they found something that had been sleeping beneath the planet's surface for what we estimated to be several million years. The Admiral paused, rubbing his temples as if the memory was physically painful. We lost 300 people before we figured out how to deal with it. The entity fed on fear, literally. It would project the deepest terrors of its victims directly into their minds, overwhelming their ability to distinguish between reality and nightmare. How did you stop it? Chen asked, though she was beginning to understand why humanity had been evacuating its people from the affected systems. We didn't stop it, Morrison said quietly. We recruited it. The silence that followed his words was deafening. Dr. Reeves looked like he might be sick, while the other team members stared at the screen in horrified fascination. You recruited a fear-eating monster? Reeves finally managed to ask. Marcus Webb, Morrison said, as if the name explained everything. He was part of the research team we sent to Kepler 442b. Former Special Forces, psychological warfare specialist, and according to his psych evaluations, completely incapable of experiencing fear in any normal sense. The entity tried to feed on him and found nothing. Chen felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard whispers about operatives like Webb in the darkest corners of military intelligence. Humans so damaged or altered by their experiences that they no longer responded to stimuli that would paralyze normal people. Instead of being consumed, Morrison continued, Webb formed some kind of symbiotic relationship with the entity. He learned to control it, to direct its abilities. For the past 60 years, he's been our most effective asset in dealing with threats that conventional warfare can't touch. And you think this shade is connected to the entity on Kepler 442b? Chen asked. I think they're the same species, Morrison replied, ancient, powerful, and hungry. But here's the thing about humans, Ambassador. We've never met a predator we couldn't either kill or domesticate. Webb's been tracking this particular entity for months, following its path of destruction. The view screen split, showing a second figure alongside Morrison. The man who appeared was unremarkable at first glance, average height and build with prematurely gray hair and pale skin. But his eyes were wrong. They held a depth of emptiness that made Chen's instincts scream warnings. Ambassador Chen, the man said, his voice carrying an odd harmonic quality that seemed to resonate in the bones. I'm Marcus Webb. I understand you're dealing with an old friend of mine. You're going after the shade, Chen said. It wasn't a question. Webb's smile was cold and predatory. I've been hunting it for 3 months. The problem is it's learned to be more careful since our last encounter. It won't come out to play unless it thinks it has easy prey. What are you suggesting? The Galactic Council wants this thing stopped, and I'm the only one who can do it, Webb said. But I need bait. Something that will draw it out of hiding and into a confrontation it can't run from. Chen felt the pieces clicking into place, and she didn't like the picture they were forming. You want to use one of the Council worlds as bait. Not just any world, Webb corrected. I want to use a world where it thinks it will find the ultimate feast. A planet full of the kind of advanced, civilized beings that have the most complex fears to feed on. Morrison leaned forward on the screen. The Council has a summit planned on Vexenari Prime in 6 days. Every major species in the galaxy will be represented, including several planetary leaders. It would be the perfect target. You want to turn a diplomatic summit into a trap, Chen said, her voice carefully neutral. I want to end this before it spreads beyond the outer rim systems, Webb replied. But I need your help to make it work. The Council trusts humanity now, partly because of your work as ambassador. They'll listen to you. Chen looked around at her team, seeing the mixture of fear and fascination in their faces. They were scientists and diplomats, not soldiers. But they were also human, and that meant they understood the sometimes brutal mathematics of survival. "What exactly would you need from us?" she asked. Webb's smile widened, and for a moment the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "I need you to convince the Council to proceed with the summit as planned, and I need you to make sure they don't evacuate when things start to get interesting. And if this plan fails, then the galaxy loses a few more worlds to something that should have stayed buried," Webb said with a shrug. "But if it succeeds, we remove a threat that could potentially consume every sentient species in known space." Chen stared at the screen for a long moment, weighing the implications of what she was being asked to do. Finally, she nodded. "Send me the operational details. I'll need to know exactly what we're walking into." "Already transmitted," Morrison said. "And Ambassador, good luck. You're going to need it." Vex Nari Prime glittered like a jewel against the cosmic backdrop, its crystalline cities reflecting the light of 3 suns in patterns that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. The planet served as the political heart of the Galactic Council, and today it hosted representatives from over 200 species for what many hoped would be a turning point in the fight against the Shade. Ambassador. Chen stood on the observation deck of the orbital station that served as the summit's venue, watching as ships from across the galaxy docked at the facility's numerous ports. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was essentially watching the galaxy's leadership walk into what could become their tomb. "Second thoughts?" asked Dr. Reeves, joining her at the massive viewport. His usual casual demeanor had been replaced by a tension that made his movements jerky and uncertain. "Third and fourth thoughts," Chen admitted. "But the alternative is watching the Shade pick off worlds one by one until there's nothing left to save." Below them, the main conference hall was a marvel of engineering and diplomacy. The circular chamber could accommodate the vastly different environmental needs of hundreds of species, with sections of varied atmosphere, gravity, and lighting. Automated translation systems ensured that every word spoken could be understood by every delegate, regardless of their species' communication method. Supreme Counselor Vex Nari called the session to order, her crystalline form reflecting the chamber's lights in prismatic patterns. "Honored delegates, we gather today in the shadow of an unprecedented threat. The entity known as the Shade has now claimed 37 systems, and our conventional defenses have proven inadequate." The assembled representatives stirred uneasily. The Altarian's feathers rustled with nervous energy, while the Quartzlings hummed in harmonics that translated as deep anxiety. Even the normally stoic mechanicals seemed to vibrate with tension. "However," Vex Nari continued, "we have received new intelligence from our human allies that may provide a path forward." Chen felt every eye in the chamber turned toward her as she rose from her seat. The operational briefing she was about to give contained carefully edited truths, designed to keep the delegates from fleeing, while providing enough information to maintain their cooperation. "The Terran Federation has encountered entities similar to the Shade in our expansion into deep space," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the translation matrix. "We've learned that these beings are not invincible. They rely on specific conditions to maintain their power, and those conditions can be disrupted." She activated the holographic display in the center of the chamber, showing what appeared to be sensor data from humanity's previous encounters. In reality, it was a carefully constructed simulation based on Webb's specifications, designed to give the delegates hope while hiding the true nature of the trap they were setting. "The entity feeds on psychic energy generated by fear and despair," Chen continued, "but it requires direct contact with its prey to be fully effective. If we can force it into a confrontation in a controlled environment, we believe it can be neutralized." The Voidnari ambassador's shadowy form rippled with skepticism. "You speak of forcing a confrontation, Ambassador Chen. This entity has shown no interest in direct conflict. It strikes from shadows and disappears before any response can be mounted." "That's because it's been choosing its targets," Chen replied. "Small research stations, isolated colonies, single ships. It's avoiding anything that might pose a real threat. But if we present it with a target too tempting to ignore—" "You mean to use us as bait?" interrupted the hegemony representative, his metallic voice carrying undertones of outrage. "You would risk the lives of every delegate in this chamber on the possibility that your species' experience applies to this threat." Chen met his accusatory gaze steadily. "I'm willing to risk my own life alongside yours. The human delegation isn't leaving this station, and neither is our security team. If this fails, we die together." What she didn't mention was that Marcus Webb was already aboard the station, hidden among the human security personnel. His modified biosignature would be undetectable to the station's sensors, and his presence would be invisible to the Shade until the moment he chose to reveal himself. Counselor Vexnari raised one crystalline hand for silence. The proposal has merit, but the risks are enormous. Perhaps we should evacuate non-essential personnel and maintain only a skeleton crew for this operation. No, Chen said firmly. The entity is intelligent. If it detects signs of an evacuation or trap, it will simply move on to an easier target. We need to maintain normal operations until the moment it arrives. The chamber erupted in heated debate, with delegates arguing in dozens of languages simultaneously. The translation matrix struggled to keep up, creating a cacophony of electronic voices that only added to the growing tension. Chen watched the chaos with a carefully neutral expression, while internally calculating the odds of their plan's success. The debate was interrupted by an emergency alert that filled the chamber with pulsing red light. All conversation ceased as Supreme Counselor Vexnari received an urgent communication through her private channel. "Honored delegates," she announced, her voice tight with controlled fear, "we have just received word that the research vessel Infinite Curiosity has gone silent approximately 4 light hours from this position. The ship was investigating the same type of ancient ruins that were found on other worlds before the Shade's arrival." Chen felt her pulse quicken. According to Webb's intelligence, the Shade had been systematically investigating these archaeological sites, possibly searching for something specific. If it had found what it was looking for, how long until it could reach this station? Asked the Terran delegate from the outer colonies, her voice barely steady. Vexnari consulted her instruments before responding. "At the entity's observed rate of travel, approximately 6 hours." The chamber exploded into chaos as delegates began demanding immediate evacuation. Some species representatives were already moving toward the exits, their diplomatic immunity forgotten in the face of mortal terror. "Wait," Chen shouted over the noise, her voice carrying an authority that made even the most panicked delegates pause. "This is exactly what we've been preparing for. The entity is coming here because it believes this station represents the ultimate prize. We can use that confidence against it." She activated her personal communicator, speaking in rapid, clipped tones that carried clearly through the chamber's audio systems. "All human security personnel, this is Ambassador Chen. Implement Protocol 7 immediately. All civilian personnel are to remain at their posts until further notice." The announcement was met with a mixture of admiration and horror from the other delegates. Protocol 7 was humanity's designation for a fight-to-the-death scenario, where retreat was not an option, and a victory was the only acceptable outcome. "You're condemning us all," whispered the representative from the peaceful collective, his translator struggling to convey the depth of his species' distress. "I'm giving us all a chance," Chen replied. "The Shade has never faced organized resistance from a prepared enemy. It's used to dealing with isolated populations that have no knowledge of its capabilities. Today that changes." What none of the other delegates knew was that even now Marcus Webb was making his final preparations in the station's lower levels. His symbiotic relationship with his own captured entity had taught him things about these creatures that no amount of scientific study could reveal. He knew their weaknesses, their fears, and most importantly, how to hurt them. As the emergency klaxons began to sound throughout the station, Chen found herself thinking about humanity's long history of turning desperate situations into victories. From ancient battles where outnumbered armies had defeated superior forces through cunning and determination, to the space age where human explorers had survived on worlds that should have killed them within hours. The Shade was about to learn why humans had earned their reputation as the galaxy's most dangerous species, not because they were the strongest or the smartest, but because they were willing to face impossible odds and somehow find a way to win. "All stations report ready," came Webb's voice through Chen's private communicator, transmitted on a frequency that the station's systems wouldn't monitor. "The guest of honor should be arriving soon." Chen looked around the chamber at the assembled delegates, many of whom were staring at her with expressions ranging from admiration to horror. In a few hours, they would either be celebrating the defeat of an ancient evil, or they would all be dead. She found that the uncertainty didn't bother her as much as it should have. After all, she was human. The first sign of the Shade's arrival was the failure of the station's external lighting. One by one, the illumination arrays that marked the orbital facility's position went dark, until the massive structure became a shadow against the star field. Inside the conference chamber, the assembled delegates watched their instruments with growing dread as sensor readings became increasingly erratic. Ambient temperature dropping by 2 degrees per minute, reported the station's chief engineer, a nervous quartzling whose harmonic voice had taken on overtones of barely controlled panic. Electromagnetic interference is increasing across all spectrums. Whatever's out there, it's big. Ambassador Chen stood at her position in the human delegation section, her external calm masking the adrenaline that was flooding her system. Through her private communicator, she could hear Marcus Webb's voice providing a steady stream of tactical updates from his position in the station's lower maintenance sections. Contact in approximately 90 seconds. Webb's voice whispered in her ear. I can feel it probing the station's defenses, looking for the easiest point of entry. It's stronger than the one I dealt with on Kepler 442b, but the basic psychology is the same. It wants to savor the fear before it feeds. Supreme Counselor Vexenari attempted to maintain order as panic began to spread through the chamber. Several delegations had already moved toward the emergency exits, only to discover that the station's security systems had been quietly activated. Sealing the conference section. This is unlawful detention, protested the hegemony representative, his metallic voice resonating with harmonic distress signals. You cannot force us to remain here against our will. I'm not forcing anyone, Chen replied calmly. But the emergency protocols are automatic once a hostile entity is detected. The station's AI is designed to protect the maximum number of lives, and that means maintaining containment until the threat is neutralized. What she didn't mention was that Webb had modified the station's systems during the past day, ensuring that no one could leave the conference area until he gave the all-clear. The delegates were trapped, but so was the Shade's intended prey, which would force the entity into the direct confrontation they needed. The lights in the chamber began to flicker, and several of the more sensitive species representatives reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, settling over them like a physical weight. The Voidnari ambassador's shadowy form became increasingly indistinct, while the Altarian's feathers stood on end as their natural fear responses activated. It's in the station, Webb's voice confirmed through Chen's communicator, moving through the outer sections, testing the crew's psychological defenses. Conventional tactics would be to evacuate the civilians, but that would give it room to maneuver. Keep everyone together. On the chamber's main display, security feeds from throughout the station showed a disturbing sight. In the corridors and workspaces, crew members had simply stopped what they were doing and now stood motionless, their eyes vacant and staring. They weren't dead, but they weren't truly alive either, caught in some kind of waking nightmare that had disconnected them from reality. Honored delegates, Vexenari announced, her crystalline voice cracking slightly with strain. I am receiving reports of crew incapacitation throughout the station. Whatever entity has boarded us appears to be moving toward this section. Dr. Reeves had gone pale as he monitored the psychological profiles of the affected crew members. Sarah, the brain activity readings are off the charts. These people are experiencing terror levels that should be physiologically impossible. Their minds are literally being overloaded with fear. Chen nodded grimly and activated her personal communicator on an open channel that all the delegates could hear. All human personnel, this is Ambassador Chen. Implement neural discipline protocols immediately. Do not engage with any sensory input that doesn't match baseline reality parameters. The announcement puzzled many of the alien delegates, but the humans in the chamber immediately began a series of breathing exercises and mental focus techniques that looked almost like meditation. What the other species didn't understand was that humanity had developed these protocols specifically for dealing with psychic threats that attacked through fear and perception. The temperature in the chamber continued to drop, and frost began forming on the viewports that looked out into space. Several delegates were now openly weeping with terror, though they couldn't explain why. The entity was broadcasting waves of pure fear, overwhelming the psychological defenses of species that had evolved on worlds where the worst threats were environmental hazards or conventional predators. 60 seconds to contact, Webb reported. I can sense its confusion. It's used to having its prey paralyzed by fear by now, but the human contingent is maintaining psychological cohesion. That's making it angry. As if summoned by his words, the main lights in the chamber suddenly went out, plunging the assembled delegates into darkness broken only by the emergency illumination systems. In that darkness, something moved that wasn't quite shadow and wasn't quite substance. Flowing through the chamber like liquid night, the shade had arrived. Its presence was immediately felt by every conscious being in the room. The entity existed partially outside normal space-time, allowing it to project itself directly into the minds of its victims. For most species, the experience was like having their worst nightmares made manifest and injected directly into their consciousness. The Altarians began screaming in harmonics that shattered several pieces of equipment. The Quartzling's singing became a discordant wail of terror that resonated through the chamber structure. Even the normally emotionless mechanicals began broadcasting distress signals as their logic circuits struggled to process inputs that violated their understanding of reality. But the humans remained standing. Chen felt the entity's attention turned toward her delegation, like a searchlight made of pure malevolence. It probed at her mind, seeking the fears and traumas that it could use to paralyze her. What it found instead was a disciplined consciousness that had been trained to recognize and compartmentalize psychological attacks. Interesting, came Webb's voice through her communicator, though she noticed the channel was now open to the entire chamber. It's never encountered organized resistance before. Look how it moves when it can't immediately overcome its prey. The shade's form became more visible as it concentrated its attention on the human delegation. It appeared as a constantly shifting amalgamation of shadow and substance, with features that seemed to change depending on the observer's deepest fears. To the Altarians, it resembled their species' ancient predators. To the Quartzlings, it looked like the crystalline parasites that had once threatened their homeworld. But to the humans, it simply looked like darkness given form, and darkness was something they had learned to face long ago. You want to know the secret? Webb's voice continued, and Chen realized he was speaking not just to her, but to the shade itself. Humans aren't fearless. We're probably more afraid than most species, because we evolved on a world that was actively trying to kill us every day. The difference is that we learned to fight anyway. The entity's response was a wave of psychic force that would have crippled most beings. Chen felt it crash against her mental defenses like a tsunami of pure terror, showing her images of every possible way she could die, every failure she had ever experienced, every moment of doubt and weakness in her entire life. She absorbed the assault, processed it, and then did something that the shade had never experienced in its millennia of existence. She smiled. "Is that the best you can do?" she asked aloud, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "Because I've seen worse things than you in the mirror on my bad days." The effect was immediate and dramatic. The shade's form wavered, its attention suddenly uncertain. For the first time in its existence, it had encountered prey that not only refused to be paralyzed by fear, but was actively mocking its efforts. "Now would be good." "Webb," Chen said into her communicator. "Already on it," came the reply, and suddenly the chamber was filled with a new presence, one that made even the shade retreat slightly. Marcus Webb stepped out of the shadows at the chamber's edge, and every delegate who looked at him immediately understood why humanity had evacuated its people from the affected systems. Webb wasn't quite human anymore, hadn't been for decades. His symbiotic relationship with his captured entity had changed him in ways that were immediately apparent to anyone with psychic sensitivity. He was something that the shade recognized, and for the first time in its ancient existence, it felt something that might have been fear. "Hello, old friend," Webb said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself seem to vibrate. "We need to talk." The confrontation between Webb and the shade transformed the conference chamber into something beyond the understanding of most galactic species. Reality itself seemed to bend around the two entities as they faced each other across the circular space, with the assembled delegates caught between forces that operated according to rules that predated conventional physics. Webb moved with fluid grace that was both human and something else entirely. The symbiotic entity he had bonded with on Kepler 442b had changed him on a fundamental level, allowing him to exist partially outside normal spacetime while retaining his essential humanity. To the delegates watching, he appeared to flicker between dimensions, sometimes solid and sometimes translucent. The shade's response was immediate and violent. It launched a psychic assault that would have destroyed the minds of everyone in the chamber, projecting waves of pure terror that manifested as physical phenomena. The temperature plummeted below freezing. Emergency systems began failing throughout the station, and several delegates collapsed as their consciousness simply couldn't process what they were experiencing. But Webb absorbed the attack like a sponge, his modified neural structure channeling the psychic energy and redirecting it harmlessly into the station's power grid. The lights flickered and stabilized, drawing power from the very forces that should have been killing everyone present. "You're stronger than the others of your kind that I've encountered," Webb said conversationally, as if commenting on the weather, rather than facing down an entity that had consumed entire civilizations. "But strength isn't everything. You've been alone for too long, haven't you? Cut off from your own species, feeding on scraps." The Shade's form writhed with what might have been anger or confusion. It had never encountered another being that could withstand its psychological attacks, let alone one that seemed to be analyzing its emotional state. Through the translation matrix, its response came as a sound like breaking glass mixed with screaming wind. "You are not prey," it managed to communicate, the words seeming to cause it physical pain to form. "What are you?" Webb's smile was cold and predatory, an expression that made several delegates instinctively move away from him, despite the greater threat posed by the Shade. "I'm what happens when humanity encounters something that thinks it's the apex predator. We have a saying on my homeworld: there's always a bigger fish." Ambassador Chen watched the exchange with fascination and growing understanding. Webb wasn't just confronting the Shade. He was studying it, learning its capabilities and limitations in real time. His decades of experience with similar entities had taught him that they were not invincible, merely operating according to different rules than most species understood. "Your kind feeds on fear," Webb continued, beginning to circle the Shade like a predator stalking wounded prey. "But you don't understand fear, do you? You've never experienced it yourself. That's your weakness." The entity's form became more agitated, its shadowy substance rippling with energy discharges that made the chamber's instruments go haywire. Several of the more sensitive species representatives were bleeding from their sensory organs as their perception apparatus struggled to process inputs that violated their understanding of reality. "Fear is just another emotion," Webb explained, his voice taking on an almost teaching tone, like anger or joy or curiosity. "Humans experience all of these things, but we don't let them control us. That's what makes us dangerous." He stopped circling and faced the Shade directly, and when he spoke again, his voice carried harmonics that resonated through dimensions the delegates couldn't even perceive. "But you want to know what real fear feels like? Let me show you." What happened next would be debated by xenopsychologists for generations. Webb somehow reversed the psychic connection that the Shade used to feed, turning the entity's own abilities against it. Instead of projecting fear into its victim's mind, Webb began projecting his own experiences directly into the Shade's consciousness. The effect was immediate and devastating. The Shade's form began to convulse as it experienced for the first time in its existence the full spectrum of human emotion. It felt the terror of a child lost in the dark, the despair of a soldier watching his comrades die, the rage of someone pushed beyond their breaking point. But more than that, it experienced the human response to these emotions, the way terror could be overcome through determination, how despair could be transformed into hope, how rage could be channeled into purpose. For a being that had spent millennia feeding on pure fear, the complexity of human emotional experience was overwhelming. "You see," Webb said, his voice gentle now, almost sympathetic, "fear isn't the end of the story for humans. It's just the beginning. Every child on Earth learns to face the dark, because they know that morning always comes." The Shade's response was a psychic scream that shattered every piece of glass in the chamber and sent several delegates into unconsciousness. But the scream contained something that surprised everyone present, including Webb. It sounded like crying. "Please," the Shade managed to communicate through the translation matrix, its voice now carrying undertones of desperate confusion. "Stop, I don't understand. How do you exist with this?" Webb's expression softened slightly, and Chen realized that despite everything he had become, there was still compassion in him. "Because we're not alone," he said simply. "When humans are afraid, we reach out to each other. We share the burden. You've been carrying the weight of existence by yourself for millions of years, haven't you?" The entity's form began to stabilize, though it still appeared agitated and uncertain. Through the psychic connection that Webb had established, the delegates could sense something like loneliness emanating from the shade, a cosmic isolation that stretched back through geological ages. "I remember," it said slowly, as if the words were being pulled from the depths of its consciousness. "Others, my kind?" Before the silence, Chen stepped forward, ignoring the warnings from her security detail. "What happened to the others of your species?" The shade's attention turned to her, and she felt the weight of its regard like standing beneath a collapsing mountain. But Webb's presence provided a buffer, allowing her to maintain her consciousness and communication. "Gone," the shade whispered through the translation matrix, "consumed by the hunger. We fought. We fed on each other. I was the last." The revelation sent a chill through the chamber that had nothing to do with temperature. The delegates were beginning to understand that they weren't just dealing with a predator, but with the sole survivor of a species that had destroyed itself through its own nature. "The archaeological sites," Dr. Reeves said suddenly, his voice shaking with excitement and horror. "You weren't just feeding. You were looking for something." The shade's form rippled with what might have been acknowledgement. "Stasis chambers, my kind. Some chose sleep, rather than hunger. I search for others, but find only emptiness." Webb nodded slowly, his expression grim. "You're not just a monster. You're a refugee, the last of your kind, trying to find some way to not be alone anymore." The chamber fell silent except for the quiet humming of the station's life support systems. The delegates were struggling to process the idea that this ancient terror was not evil in any conventional sense, but rather a being driven to monstrous acts by isolation and desperation. "The question now," Webb said, his voice carrying an authority that made even the shade seem to listen, "is what we do about it." Chen felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. As humanity's representative to the galactic community, her next words would determine not just the fate of the shade, but potentially the future relationship between humanity and the rest of the galaxy. What she decided would echo through history, one way or another. The silence in the chamber stretched for what felt like hours. Though the chronometers indicated only minutes had passed, Ambassador Chen stood between two entities that existed partially outside normal reality, feeling the weight of a decision that would reshape the galaxy's understanding of both justice and compassion. The assembled delegates watched with a mixture of fascination and terror as the shade maintained its unstable form, no longer the confident predator that had entered the chamber, but something resembling a lost child seeking guidance. The psychic emanations that had once projected pure fear now carried undertones of confusion, loneliness, and something that might have been hope. "There are precedents," Chen said finally, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber despite speaking barely above a whisper. "In human history, we've dealt with individuals whose actions were monstrous but whose circumstances were complicated." Supreme Counselor Vexnari's crystalline form shimmered with uncertainty. "Ambassador Chen, this entity has consumed the populations of 37 systems. How can you speak of precedents?" "Because sometimes the line between victim and perpetrator isn't as clear as we'd like it to be," Chen replied, her gaze never leaving the shade's writhing form. "Webb, can your symbiotic entity communicate directly with the shade? Help us understand what we're really dealing with?" Webb nodded slowly and closed his eyes, his form becoming even more translucent as he deepened his connection with the entity that shared his consciousness. When he spoke again, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate through dimensions that most species couldn't perceive. "It's been alone for over 4 million years, he reported, his words carrying an emotional weight that made several delegates visibly uncomfortable. Its species evolved on a world where psychic energy was as common as electromagnetic radiation. They fed on the emotions of other life forms, but not destructively. They were more like psychic gardeners, cultivating and harvesting emotional experiences without harming their sources." The shade's form stabilized slightly, and through the translation matrix its voice carried a note of what might have been gratitude. "We were custodians, shepherds of feeling. We nurtured joy, wonder, love, fed only on the excess." Dr. Reeves stepped forward, his xenopsychologist training overriding his fear. "What changed? How did you become what you are now?" The response came in waves of psychic imagery that the translation system struggled to convert into language. The delegates saw flashes of a dying world, of a species driven to desperation as their traditional food sources vanished. They witnessed the gradual transformation of a race of gardeners into predators, as starvation drove them to consume rather than cultivate. The great silence, the shade explained, its voice heavy with ancient grief. Our galaxy died. The life forms we tended vanished. We turned on each other, consumed our own kind, rather than face extinction. I alone survived. I alone remembered what we once were. The revelation sent shockwaves through the chamber. Several delegates were openly weeping, their species' empathic responses triggered by the depth of loss and regret emanating from the shade. Even the normally stoic mechanicals seemed affected, their logic circuits struggling to process the emotional complexity of the situation. 4 million years of searching, Webb continued, his voice carrying the weight of cosmic loneliness, moving from galaxy to galaxy looking for others of its kind, finding only primitive life forms that couldn't provide the complex emotional energy it needed to survive. So it learned to create that complexity through fear and despair. Ambassador Chen felt pieces of a larger picture falling into place, the archaeological sites. You weren't just looking for stasis chambers. You were trying to understand how other species developed psychic sensitivity. The shade's form rippled with acknowledgement. I sought to create others, like me, so I would not be alone. But your minds are fragile. They break when I try to share. The confession hung in the air like a physical presence. The entity that had terrorized the galaxy was not a malevolent force, but a being so desperate for companionship that it had been accidentally destroying the very minds it was trying to connect with. Supreme Counselor Vexenari's voice carried a tremor as she spoke. The crew members you affected, they're not dead, are they? You've been trying to convert them? Failed attempts, the shade admitted, its voice heavy with shame. I do not know how to touch without breaking. Your species are so different from mine. Webb opened his eyes and looked directly at Chen. There's a solution, but it's not one that the Council is going to like. The entity on Kepler 442b, the one I bonded with, it was dying when we found it. The symbiotic relationship saved both of us, but it required changes. Chen understood immediately what he was suggesting, and the implications made her feel cold despite the chamber's restored heating. You're talking about creating more beings like yourself. Humans who can serve as bridges. Not exactly, Webb corrected. I'm talking about teaching it how to connect without destroying. But that would require test subjects who can survive the process long enough to establish proper protocols. The chamber erupted in protests from multiple delegations. The idea of deliberately exposing sapient beings to an entity that had proven capable of destroying minds was anathema to most galactic species ethical systems. Absolutely not, declared the hegemony representative. We cannot sanction the deliberate mutation of sapient beings, regardless of the potential benefits. But Chen was studying the readings on her personal scanner, analyzing the psychic emanations from both Webb and the Shade. What's the volunteer rate among human deep space exploration teams? She asked suddenly. Dr. Reeves looked confused by the question. For what kind of mission? For first contact with entities that exist outside normal spacetime, Chen replied, with full disclosure of the risks and potential for permanent psychological alteration. Reeves consulted his datapad, though he seemed reluctant to provide the information. According to the last survey, approximately 37% of qualified personnel expressed willingness to accept extreme risk assignments if the potential scientific or diplomatic value was significant enough. The number sent another wave of shocked silence through the chamber. The idea that more than a third of humans would willingly risk their sanity for the sake of knowledge or diplomacy was incomprehensible. To most galactic species, that's not enough volunteers for a proper research program, Chen mused, as if discussing a routine scientific endeavor rather than a project that could result in the creation of beings like Webb. We'd need at least 100 qualified candidates to establish safe protocols. 312, Webb said quietly. That's how many humans have already volunteered for the project, based on the preliminary briefings Admiral Morrison sent out yesterday. The revelation that humans were not only willing, but eager to undergo such a transformation left the assembled delegates speechless. Even the shade seemed taken aback by the response, its form flickering with what might have been amazement. "Your species," it began, then stopped, struggling to find words that could convey its confusion. "You would risk your minds, your very selves, to help me?" Chen smiled, and for the first time since the confrontation began, her expression was genuinely warm. "That's what humans do. We see a problem and we figure out how to fix it, even if the solution seems impossible." She activated her communicator and spoke in the calm, authoritative tone that had served her well throughout her diplomatic career. "Admiral Morrison, this is Ambassador Chen. Please transmit the volunteer protocols to the Galactic Council for review. It looks like we're going to need them." As the transmission went out, Chen turned back to face the shade, whose form had become more stable and somehow less threatening than it had appeared when it first entered the chamber. "The question now," she said, "is whether you're willing to try a different approach to solving your loneliness. One that doesn't involve accidentally destroying the minds you're trying to connect with." The shade's response was immediate and filled with an emotion that the translation systems had never been designed to handle. For the first time in 4 million years, an ancient being experienced something that humans would recognize as gratitude. "Yes," it whispered through the matrix, its voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself seem to sing. "Please, teach me how to touch without breaking." 6 months after the confrontation at Vexnari Prime, the research station New Horizons orbited a carefully chosen dead system on the edge of Terran space. The facility had been purpose-built for what had become known as the Communion Project, humanity's attempt to bridge the gap between conventional consciousness and entities that existed partially outside normal reality. Ambassador Chen stood in the observation lounge, watching through reinforced viewports as the latest group of volunteers underwent the preparation protocols. The humans moved with calm efficiency through procedures that would have terrified most galactic species, their faces showing the mixture of excitement and determination that had become the hallmark of the project's participants. "Status report," she said to Dr. Reeves, who had become the project's chief psychological coordinator despite his initial reservations. "Remarkable progress," Reeves replied, consulting his datapad with an expression of professional amazement. "We've successfully established stable communion links with 47 volunteers. No psychological breaks, no permanent trauma, and most importantly, no accidental consciousness transfers." Through the viewport, Chen could see the entity that had once been called the Shade moving among the volunteers like a teacher working with eager students. Its form had stabilized considerably over the past months, appearing less like living shadow and more like a graceful humanoid figure made of starlight and possibility. The transformation had been gradual but dramatic. As the entity learned to connect with human consciousness without overwhelming it, it had begun to remember aspects of its original nature that had been buried under millions of years of desperate hunger. The psychic gardener was slowly emerging from beneath the predator it had been forced to become. "The irony isn't lost on me," Webb said, joining them at the viewport. His own appearance had continued to evolve as his symbiotic relationship deepened, but he remained recognizably human, despite the otherworldly qualities that now surrounded him. "The galaxy's most feared predator is turning out to be one of the best teachers we've ever encountered." Chen nodded, watching as one of the volunteers, a young woman named Dr. Sarah Kim, raised her hand in what had become the standard gesture for requesting deeper communion. The entity responded by extending what might have been a hand made of pure thought, and when they touched, both figures became translucent for a moment before solidifying again. "How are the volunteers handling the experience?" Chen asked. "Better than anyone expected," Reeves replied. "The entity's original species evolved sophisticated techniques for sharing consciousness without damage. As it remembers these methods, it's teaching them to our people. Some volunteers report that the communion experience is the most profound moment of their lives." The research station's intercom crackled to life, carrying the voice of Admiral Morrison from Earth. "Ambassador Chen, please report to the communication center. We have incoming transmissions from across the galaxy." Chen made her way through the station's corridors, noting the subtle changes that had occurred as human technology adapted to accommodate their unusual research. Psychic dampening fields created safe zones for non-enhanced personnel, while communion chambers allowed for controlled interaction between human volunteers and their ancient teacher. The communication center was buzzing with activity as staff. Members monitored incoming messages from dozens of star systems. The main display showed a galactic map with communication nodes lighting up across multiple sectors. "What's the situation?" Chen asked. "Word about the project has spread," Morrison explained through the transmission link. "We're receiving requests from 17 different species asking for similar programs. Apparently, there are other entities like the Shade scattered throughout the galaxy, and several civilizations want to try the communion approach rather than continuing to treat them as threats." Chen studied the display, noting the distribution of the requests. They covered nearly every major trade route and political alliance in known space. Have any of these other entities shown signs of the Shade's original cooperative nature? 3 so far, Morrison replied. The Voidnari reported that an entity they've been tracking for centuries has begun attempting what appears to be non-destructive contact. The Quartzlings have detected similar behavior changes in something they call the Silent Singer. Even the Mechanicals have reported unusual patterns in an entity that's been interfering with their deep space operations. The implications were staggering. If there were others of the Shade species scattered throughout the galaxy, survivors who had spent millions of years in desperate isolation, the Communion Project could potentially transform the fundamental nature of galactic civilization. There's more, Morrison continued. The entity you're working with has been sending out some kind of signal, apparently calling to others of its kind. Our long-range sensors are detecting responses from at least 7 different sectors. Chen felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The success of the project had been remarkable, but expanding it to handle multiple entities would require resources and coordination on a scale that the galaxy had never attempted. "Admiral, I need you to convene an emergency session of the Galactic Council. Full disclosure this time. Complete transparency about what we've accomplished and what we're proposing to attempt." "Already in motion," Morrison replied. "The Council has agreed to meet at New Horizons Station in 72 hours. They want to observe the Communion Project firsthand before making any decisions about expansion." Chen closed the communication link and returned to the observation lounge, where she found Webb and Reeves still watching the volunteers work with their ancient teacher. The scene had an almost surreal quality. Humans and an entity from beyond normal space-time working together with the casual efficiency of any research team. "How do you think the Council will react?" Reeves asked. "They'll be terrified and fascinated in equal measure," Chen replied. "But I think they'll approve the expansion. The alternative is returning to the old policy of treating these entities as threats to be avoided or destroyed." Webb's expression was thoughtful, as he watched Dr. Kim successfully establish what appeared to be a stable two-way communion link. "The entity is learning as much from us as we are from it. It's starting to understand human concepts like hope, friendship, and voluntary cooperation. Ideas that its species never developed because they evolved in a very different environment. And what is it teaching us?" Chen asked. "That consciousness is far more flexible than we ever imagined," Webb replied. "That the boundaries between self and other, between individual and collective awareness, are largely artificial constructs. The volunteers aren't losing their humanity through the communion process. They're expanding it." The observation was interrupted by an alert from the station sensors. Something was approaching from deep space, moving at velocities that conventional ships couldn't achieve. The signature was similar to the Shades, but different enough to suggest it might be another entity responding to the signal. "It looks like we're about to get our first visitor," Chen said, watching the sensor display with a mixture of anticipation and concern. Through the viewport, she could see the Shade suddenly become more alert, its form brightening as it turned toward the approaching presence. When it spoke, its voice carried through the station's communication system with harmonics that suggested profound joy. "Sibling comes," it announced, the simple words carrying emotional weight that made several volunteers stop their work to listen. "After so long, Sibling answers the call." Chen realized they were about to witness something that hadn't happened in millions of years. A reunion between members of an ancient species that had thought itself extinct. The implications for the galaxy, for the future of interspecies relations, and for humanity's role in that future were staggering. "Dr. Reeves," she said quietly, "I think we're going to need more volunteers." Through the viewport, the stars seemed to shimmer as 2 entities that had been separated by eons of loneliness prepared to rediscover what it meant to not be alone. And around them, human volunteers stood ready to serve as bridges between worlds of consciousness that had never been meant to touch. The galaxy was about to change in ways that no one could have predicted. And once again, it was humanity that stood at the center of that transformation. Not because they were the strongest or the smartest, but because they were willing to reach out their hands to beings that others would have destroyed and say the simple words that could reshape the universe. You don't have to be alone anymore. The age of communion had begun, and the galaxy would never be the same.